China seems to present an enormous puzzle. And here's the way, and here's one simple way to see it. That the World Bank carries out a detailed survey of 185 or so countries in the world, and they collect granular data on a bunch of different things that private businesses do. So things like, how long does it take in order to get a license? How long does it take to get a power how long does it take to get a power connection? And if you look at the data in 2013, and there's a reason why I chose 2013, because something happened in 2013 to the World Bank doing business indicators. If you look at the World Bank's data on the ease of starting a business, okay, China ranks 151 in the world. There were 185 countries in the survey in the year, so it was near the very bottom of the world in terms of overall ease. And basically what they're measuring is basically, how many taxes you have to pay, the rules that you have to follow. And just to get a sense of what 151 means, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, so this is the DRC of Mobutu, is 152. Haiti does better at 140. So when you look at metrics like this, since Dadon is here, China looks very much like what Dadon would call a failed state. So what we want to do is to try to explain this puzzle. Why is it that by metrics like this, it looks like a failed state, but in terms of outcomes, it looks very different? So the way I want to start is that I want to start with just giving you a story of what is it that happens on the ground? What is it that happens on the ground? And this is the story that comes from a visit that my two co-authors made to a small city in southern China. Okay, so Chong-En is here, so he can correct the details if I have the details wrong. But one of Chong-En's former students was a vice mayor in this city, was a vice mayor of the education department in this city. So he and my other co-author went to the city, I think it was in 2013, but you can correct me, in the summer of so just so you know, this was the vice mayor in charge of schooling, okay? So when they went to the vice mayor's office in charge of schooling, I think the story is that the vice mayor was actually not there, so they met up with his chief of staff, and the chief of staff handed him this flow chart of what is it that the vice mayor's office for education does. Okay, so he proudly handed over this flow chart and said, this is what we do in the vice mayor's office for, and then here's a rough translation of what this flow chart says. So again, this is a work plan of the vice mayor's office of education, and he says that, we actively look for quality prospects, we have an initial discussion to learn about the investor, we undertake a feasibility analysis, we identify land and other needed services. Whatever it is they're talking about goes for the approval of the vice mayor, and then we sign the agreement. Now, if you think about this, what is the vice mayor's office for education doing? Okay? Now, you could think that this is about schools, but very quickly, and I guess very quickly that this is not about schools. What you learn very quickly is that what the vice mayor's office of education is doing is exactly what you think that they are doing, that they're basically going out and they're basically soliciting business. So what they mean when they say act to look for quality prospects, they're basically trying to get companies to come into this city, okay? So let me just tell you something more about the organization of this city, of this particular city. The number one guy in this city is the Communist Party secretary. The number two person is the mayor. There are 9 vice mayors in the city. The person that was Chong-En's student was one of the 9 vice mayors. And by their metric, it looks like roughly, so the way that this particular city operates is that each one of these vice mayors had roughly, I'm going to use the word portfolio, of about 20 projects or 20 companies that they were responsible for. And what I mean by responsible for is that they're basically, if you think about the World Bank, the things that are being measured by the World Bank doing business indicators, it's about basically carving out special deals so that these 20 companies, each one of these guys, can basically get exemptions to these rules. So the way that you want to think about this city, it was roughly a city of about 2 million people, a city about 2 million people, employment about 800,000. So roughly about 200 to 250 companies have special deals, which meant that basically they got everything that they wanted in order to make things work. And then we don't know for sure, but our sense is that these are typically the largest companies that are in the city. So roughly, you want to think that 300 to 350,000 workers work in companies that have access to these deals. Okay, so let me just summarize what we think the system is and try to lay it out for me. So here's a quote that I got from somebody who does business in China. So this is one way in which you may want to think about it. And so this is what the person says, the way that you want to think about it. Each locality operates like a standalone company. They prompt investment, strong-arm banks for finance, and often hold shares in the businesses themselves. Localities operate almost like a holding company for local business. I find that a useful way to think about it. At the same time, the local party's overwhelming powers within its own borders effectively make each district its own separate jurisdiction with direct control over the courts and over local regulations governing business activities. So think of the model as basically it's the use of the power of the local Communist Party to make private businesses work. That's essentially what this guy is saying. But it's incomplete. So what we want to add to this is that it's not just the use of the power of the local Communist Party to make businesses work. That it's a use of the power only for a subset of firms, only for what I'm going to call the favored firms or firms who have access to deals. The second piece that this quote doesn't quite capture, but we think is an important part of the story, is that it's not just one Communist Party that does this, but there's tremendous amount of competition between all the different localities that are trying to do exactly the same thing. And I want to show that we think that this is an important part of what has made the system work in some sense. Okay, so the way I want to illustrate this is that I want to talk about how this particular policy played out. Okay, I want to talk about this thing called the strategic and pillar industry policy. So the way that you want to think about this is that there's a lot of discussion now about Chinese industrial policy, about this policy by the central government called Made in China 2025. So think about the strategic and pillar industry as being the precursor of the Made in China 2025. So what is this in substance? That in the late 1990s, there were 9 industries that were designated as strategic and pillar. Okay? What that meant effectively was that only designated state-owned firms were allowed to be in these sectors. Okay? What you can show is that despite this policy, empirically, when you look at the data, what you saw was that since the late 1990s, what you saw was massive entry of unauthorized firms, most of them private, not all of them were private, into the strategic and pillar industries. And then what local governments were doing was an important part of why this strategic and pillar industry policy didn't quite play out in the way that it was designed. And the way I want to illustrate this is by talking about one of these strategic and pillar industries. I want to talk about the Chinese car industry. Okay? And we believe it's a nice illustration of both the costs and the benefits of how the system works. Okay? So I want to talk about this company. I want to talk about General Motors in China. So the story of General Motors, so General Motors is perhaps the most successful US company in China. It sells about 1.5 million cars a year in China. It's the largest car manufacturer in China. So the structure of this company is that so how does GM fit in the strategic and pillar industry policy? Well, the way that GM entered into China was that it operates a joint venture with this other Chinese company called the Shanghai Motor Corporation, which is one of the state-owned firms that was part of the strategic and pillar industry policy. So GM operates in China through this company called Shanghai GM, which is 50% owned by GM and 50% owned by this state-owned firm. And the Shanghai Motor Corporation, it's a publicly listed firm, but the majority stake is held by this holding company called the Shanghai Group. and the group itself is owned by the local government of the city of Shanghai. So just so you get a sense of this company, it also owns 50% of Shanghai Volkswagen. So if you've ever been to Shanghai and you wonder why all the taxis are Volkswagen, this is the reason why. There's one way to try to figure out where the powers are in China is to go to each city and just look at the taxis. I mean, it's a really, like if you ever go to Beijing, you will wonder why the taxis are all Hyundais. There's a reason why. I don't know whether you've noticed, but if you ever paid attention, that's what you're going to see. And the SAIC also owns a standalone car company. That was the original state-owned firm. Okay, that was the original state-owned firm that was authorized to make cars. So what did GM want in China? Okay, well, the first thing it wanted was that it wanted monopoly rights. So one of the things that GM got was that it got the monopoly to sell cars above a certain size. Okay, so that's one of just the concrete things it got. But more broadly, what GM wanted was that it wanted to get the support of the Communist Party of the city of Shanghai, which at that time was effectively running the central government. So this is the period of Jiang Zemin. So here's a quote that I found that illustrates this idea clearly. That basically says, the commercial goal of selling more GM Buicks and Chevrolets in China becomes a political and economic campaign to enhance the power and the might of the city of Shanghai. So that basically this company, GM, is an integral part of the portfolio of the city of Shanghai. Think of it as a Shanghai Inc. with the Communist Party secretary as a chairman and the CEO. And somebody told me a joke that in 2009, GM became a joint venture of the Communist Party of China and the US Treasury, which it was. There was one part that was bankrupt, and there was one part that was making money. But what GM was afraid of, so what I've had discussion with people who were running GM at the time. The guy happens to be running Archer Daniel Midlands now. But what they were afraid of was a theft of their intellectual property. So there were detailed protocols that indicate that certain number of management positions, certain number of engineers from the other company were to work in this joint venture. So, and now if you think about, what's the cost of so GM wanted the monopoly rights. It wanted the support of the local city apparatus. But the cost of this was that, well, if your partner ever were to steal your intellectual property, well, which court do you go to? The court that you go to is going to be, the judge is going to be the person that's appointed by the person that stole your intellectual property in the first place. So the response that GM made to solve this problem, so this is what the person who ran GM at the time indicated to me, that, okay, the way that we're going to square this circle is that we're only going to sell cars that if our partner were to ever steal our intellectual property, then they're never going to be able to sell this car outside of China. So the first car that GM sold outside of China was the Buick New Century, which they introduced in China in 2001. It had gone out of production in the US 10 years before, and it retailed in Shanghai for about $44,000 at the time. Again, that's what. So GM was doing really well. Now, obviously, for the Chinese consumers weren't doing that well as a result of this. But let me tell you the sequel to the story. So GM then, what they continued to do later was that they continued to introduce new cars, and they continued their strategy of basically bringing in their older designs, selling it in the Chinese market at a markup. Now, where they started to run into trouble was in the third car that they tried to sell into the Chinese market. They took a design from their Korean subsidiary, Daewoo, and they rebranded it as a GM car, and they began to try to start the process of building a new plant and trying to sell that new car in China. What happened with this third car was that before GM was ready to sell their new car, they found out that another Chinese company had come onto the market before they were ready to sell, got a hold of the blueprints, and basically sold exactly the same car. So somebody was ripping off the intellectual property of the Shanghai party boss. Okay, what was this company? It's this company called Chery. Okay, so I have a copy, I have a picture of the two cars. This is a picture of the GM car, which is itself a clone of the Daewoo car. And this is the Chinese clone of the clone, right? So this is the Chery car. And then the GM engineers would say that they went and bought a copy of this car. It's hard to buy this car in Shanghai for the obvious reasons that, that Chery finds it very hard to sell in the Shanghai market because there's the local boss there, and then you can't sell in the market. So if you try to sell, they say, well, there are these 350 rules that you have to follow. But so let me tell you a little bit about the story of this company, because I think it illustrates where the competition is coming from. So Chery is a company, it's based in the city of Wuhu, which is not unlike the city that Chong'an and Michael visit. It's a small city, was a poor city of about 2 million people. It was founded by these two people. Okay, this guy called Mr. Zhan, and who was the vice mayor of the city, and a guy called Mr. Yin. It's hard to know who exactly started the company. You get different stories depending on who you talk to. But the story of this guy, Mr. Yin, he was the engineer, and he had spent maybe 20 years of his life working in this state-owned company called First Auto Works. And the main project that he had was that he was the guy responsible for a joint venture that First Auto Works had with Volkswagen. So one of the things that he did was that he basically went and relocated an old VW plant outside of Pittsburgh, relocated that plant to China, and they started to make VW cars. So the way that he describes it was that this was a really important process for him, because he learned how to set up a car company, how to set up the plant, how to set things up with the suppliers. And at some point, he would say that he wanted to do something of his own. He wanted to set up a company of his own. So imagine you want to build a car company, okay? You need $1 billion. I guess I don't know how much you need. But in the case of China, there was a very easy path to get this done. What you do is that instead of going down Sand Hill Road or whatever it is, he knocked on the doors of several party bosses, collected offers, and decided that this particular city gave him the best deal. Okay, so here's a quote from Mr. Yin on what was the agreement that he had with the vice mayor. So the quote from the vice mayor was that, you let me take care of the politics, you just focus on getting some cars built here. So think about this as, you have these two guys, okay? One knows how to make cars, but doesn't have the foggiest idea about politics. The other one doesn't have the foggiest idea how to make cars, but knows about the politics. What is the politics? The politics is essentially the strategic and pillar industry, which is that they were not allowed to make cars. It was illegal for them to. That's what he means by the politics. So what happened? Well, the first thing the Wuhu vice mayor did is that they went and asked for an exemption to the strategic and pillar industry. The answer came back very quickly, no, don't even think about it. Then what they did is that they got a permit to purchase a car engine. They got a permit, and then they took that permit and they bought an old Ford engine plant in the UK. They started to make engines. Then they went back and they got a license to make cars, but that would only be sold in their city. And then with that limited license, they went and bought an old VW plant up in Spain. They relocated that to China. They started to make clones of the VW. Then there's a process which I'm sure that Chong'an will tell you more about how they got access to the full license, but it involved them basically giving 20% of their equity to the Shanghai state-owned firm that was the partner of Shanghai GM. Then they got the full license to make cars. They got the full license to make cars, and then the second car they made was the clone. So let me just end by just saying, Chery is legally registered as a state-owned firm. The Wuhu local government holds the majority stake. It is the largest exporter of cars from China. Okay, Shanghai GM does not export. So the way I think what this all tells you is that that the fact that there's a possibility of exporting your stuff, think of this as being exactly what you would expect to see if your natural trading partner has high trade barriers on you. So let me just show you one last picture of my last trip to Colombia. So I was in this small town in Villa Vicencio, which is a small city about 100 miles south of the capital city. And the cars of the Colombian middle class were the Korean cars and Chery. And the cars are Chery. So I took a picture. All right, I'll end here.